everybody have a decent weekend?
Not long enough.
Not long enough. Yawn. What we doing, out partying or something all weekend long?
Oh, 100%.
I went to a party in New Mexico.
I'm a respectable college kid, I don't go to parties.
Oh, really? I used to be a respectable college kid. I've got a respectable college kid living with me. Clock's off just a little bit. Look at people start dragging into the glass room. Good morning.
Morning, Mr. Hunt.
Good morning.
Those microphones are just a real pain. Sometimes when you push down the button, they stay on, sometimes they don't. I'm just very happy to see them disappear. Okay, while I was doing my homework over the weekend, I noticed something on the quiz. Nobody said anything to me about it, so I figured, I guess you were all happy not being able to get 100 on it. First of all, there are at least 6 people that didn't complete the quiz. And I hate to start a morning off being like an old grump and all of that, but this is a serious undertaking we're doing, and you have deadlines for things. And if you don't meet the deadline, my patience is going to run out, and I'm going to stop reopening the quiz for you, and you're going to start getting zeros. And if you get 3 of those in a row, the 4th one means you're out of the class. So take that very seriously. This should be an easy way to get a good grade in your class, but if you don't take advantage of it, you're going to have problems. Everyone's being treated as an adult in this class, and as an adult you will find you have responsibilities you have to live up to. I went through the quiz, and because some people haven't taken it yet, I'm not going to talk about the whole quiz, but there's a question about the Navigation Act. And I committed an anachronism. I stuck a word in there that didn't exist back then, which was the UK. The UK means the United Kingdom. The UK, that's the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Nowadays it's England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. It didn't exist until 1800. So it certainly couldn't have anything to do with the Navigation Act. What I meant to write in there and should have written in there was England. So having done that and seeing a whole long string of 90s, which should have been hundreds, I got soft and corrected my mistake. Well, I'll never let you suffer for my mistake. So everybody that should have got 100 if they didn't bump into that question has 100 now. I fixed them. There were 2 people. Let's see where they're from. David Martinez, where are you? How about Madeline Zamora? Are you also there? Where's Madeline? Oh, I can. Oh, what are you going like this? Wave your hand so I can see it. Both of them figured out what we were talking about in there and got the answers right. So 2 people got a natural 100. The rest of you got an assisted 100. But since it was my fault, that's not on you. Okay. We got down to talking about issues of slavery, and I kind of started in talking about some of the laws that we made to justify slavery. I'm going to leave it there. We're going to talk about something else that's important to understand, especially when you study American history, but when you study history anywhere. No country lives in a vacuum. And our colonies are exactly the same. So not only do they have events going on inside that country, but they're influenced by events from other places. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about external influences that affect the early colonies. There's a set of slides that you've got. I want to say that's Unit 3. In Unit 3, that I'll brush over really fast until I get up to a period of time I really want to talk about. But you can look at the other slides at your own, because I talk about some of the outside things that were happening when all these different colonies were found. But let's, in general, let me put this up so it's big enough to read. Some of the European things that happened while these colonies were forming, and don't try and write them all down, you can, because we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail. The 30 Years' War was going on in Europe from about 1618 until 1648. That started out as an internal issue inside the Holy Roman Empire, and it's going to spread until all the European countries are involved, and indirectly we're involved. Then there are British Civil Wars. I should put plural there, because there's a bunch of them. 2 of them conducted by one king, Charles I of England, where he has fights with Parliament, and he's defeated twice in a row, and the second time he was defeated, they got tired of the whole thing, and they killed him. There was another British Civil War when his son took over. Then he had to run for it and went to Europe and stayed with his cousin, Louis XIV of France. Skip over the Triple Alliance. That was a war involving, believe it or not, France and England on one side, trying to keep Spain from expanding too much. Then in England there's the Glorious Revolution, and we'll talk about that. And also, interwoven with all of these things are 3 wars with the Dutch, the Anglo-Dutch Wars. I don't talk a lot about those, but the first one started when Oliver Cromwell, and we've talked about him, when he was running England and got the first Navigation Act passed in 1651, and you do know about those. You suffered through them in the weekend, if not no other time, because they cut the Dutch out of trade with England, out of Dutch shipping out of trading with England. And the Dutch were affronted by this, and they upset the British. The British used a little bit of not being polite as an excuse for war, and went to war in 1652. In 1665, a little bit more than 10 years later, there's going to be a second Anglo-Dutch War. England's trying to dominate sea trade. They start letting privateers and people like that capture Dutch ships. They go to war. Early on in the war, the English are very successful. They defeat the Dutch in a number of major battles, sea battles. But then, in the 1665-1666 period, England has 2 giant disasters. One of them is the Great Fire of London, and the other one is the plague. And while they were kind of weakened, the Dutch slipped over to England, sailed up the Thames River, and wiped out the British fleet, a major portion of it. And the English, under Charles II, had to kind of sue for peace. by this time Parliament had kind of lost the interest. Up until this time, the English public was really excited. They were excited about going to war with France, and we're going to show, or not France, with Holland, we're going to show them who's who. But after that disaster at a place they called the Midway on the way up to London, up the Thames River, they didn't have any big appetite to go to war again. But they're going to get dragged into another war, and Charles II is still king, because he made a secret deal with his cousin, Louis XIV, to help him out if he decided to try and fight the Dutch. And Louis XIV in France wanted to try and nibble away at the southern part of the Republic of Holland, or the Dutch Republic, if you want to call it that. And Charles II is obligated by his secret treaty to lend British ships to help the French attack the Dutch. The Dutch suffer some casualties early in that war, but eventually they latch onto a desperate measure. You see, Holland is below sea level, so as the French army advanced in, they just pulled the plug out of the dike and just started flooding whole large areas of Holland, so the French couldn't walk across them anymore. And eventually the French are going to give up, and then the English are going to have to figure out how to back out of it too. What's important about all these things, and we will look at them in more detail, while this is all going on, the English aren't paying any attention at all to the colonies. You know, what's the old line about, when the cat's away, the mice will play, or whatever, and the colonies are expanding and doing whatever they want to do, including sneaking down and doing trade with the Spanish from time to time and all sorts of things. They're left to protect themselves. One of the effects, well, we'll talk about it. Let's skip on. I'm just giving you, there's some nice slides. That's the war, what they call the War of the Three Kingdoms. These are all the British Civil Wars involving Scotland, sometimes Ireland, and England. And that famous painting is a picture of Charles II from three angles. Kind of an interesting painting. Boy, those guys look alike. Well, maybe you know why now. Those are some of the people who figured in the Civil War. Of course, in the middle is Oliver Cromwell, who more or less ruled England for about 5 years, probably longer than that. He actually was pretty much in control from the time Charles I was executed. Now, one of the effects early on that we're going to see is something called the New England Confederation. And it's caused by what's going on in England during the Civil Wars and some other things that are going on internationally that we'll talk about in a minute when we get to it. But basically, it was called the United Colonies of New England. It had Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth and Connecticut and a colony called New Haven, which will also be part of Connecticut later on, all teamed together to defend themselves against two potential enemies. One, the Indians, especially those Indians from the north side of the Great Lakes who were sponsored by the French. And then to the south side of these New England colonies were the Dutch colonies. And although the Dutch colonies will fall into the hands of the English in the 1660s, at this stage of the game they're still worried about Dutch influence there. This confederation is the first kind of joining together of different colonies that happens in the in English North America. They weren't seeking independence or anything. They were just trying to defend themselves in the absence of British help to defend them. There's that Second Civil War. The period in between when Charles I was executed, and a little bit after that until 1660 is called the Interregnum. When Charles II is invited to come back to England and be king, that's called the Restoration. while Cromwell was running things, and we talked about this several times before, he's going to get past that Navigation Act. There's the Anglo-Dutch War. You got that all memorized. There's Charles II back in the saddle again. There's his daughter, Princess Mary, who goes off and marries William of Orange in Holland. That's supposed to settle out some of the fighting in between the two sides. She's pretty loyal to her husband, although he was her first cousin, and she didn't want to marry him. But eventually she got over her complaints. We talked about all the things after the Restoration that Charles did. He chartered Carolina Colony. He set up New York Province. Passed 3 Navigation Acts. Set up the Royal Africa Company. That was all about golden slaves. So in 1660, right when he gets back on the throne, there's another little issue. We talked about the slavery thing already. England's getting their nose into the slave trade big time. Why? Big money. They don't have slaves in England, but the slave trade was really profitable. He's also going to sell some territory that became Pennsylvania colony, named in honor, it's going to be named after Sir William Penn by his son, William Penn. Those are his wives. One of the things he tried to do was make life easier for Catholics. Now what we know is he had a secret deal with Louis XIV of France that eventually, this is one reason he went to fight and help them and got involved in that Third Anglo-Dutch War. Louis XIV was going to pay him a salary, go figure, was going to pay him money, he was going to give him a big grant the day he stood up in front of the English people and said, "Surprise, I'm Catholic." Well, we never got around to that. But he did declare indulgence, kind of an act to try and take the heat off the Catholics, but Parliament wouldn't allow it to be passed. One of the big things he did to the colonies was create something called the Dominion of New England. And he lumped all the New England colonies and some of the middle colonies, including New York and New Jersey, together. Let's see if I've got a slide on that. There it is, right there. The governor was a guy named Sir Edmund Andros. It started just with New England, but he adds in New York, named after his younger brother. Sir Edmund Andros had assistant governors in different portions of this because it was too big an area for him to control. About the time that James II is going to get kicked out and replaced by William and Mary, which is about to happen in the Glorious Revolution in 1688, some of the colonies actually rise up against Sir Edmund Andros' assistants and kick them out or just have violent demonstrations. Down in New York, they kicked them out. And a fellow by the name of Jacob Leisler is going to take over as the caretaker governor of New York, thinking that he's just going to hand the keys over to William and Mary's representative, which he does, in fact, but then he's arrested, accused of treason, and hanged, drawn, and quartered. We went through this, I think, last time. We talked about it, maybe. Did we? You want to know what hanged, drawn, and quartered is? Anybody really want to know? Anybody ever see The Patriot? Okay. Instead of dropping you from a gibbet and breaking your neck, they raise you with the rope around your neck, and while you're still squirming, they cut your gut open, and they pull it out, and your entrails will stretch a long distance, and don't ask me why I know that. And then they burn your entrails right in front of your face while you're still alive. And by that time, you're probably dead. And then they divide your body into pieces, and they stick those pieces up. When they were doing it in England, the four sides of the city of London, as an example for people that are thinking about taking over the government. I think that's the only instance when this was part of a sentence, and they didn't really do it the way they were supposed to do with Jacob Leisler. There were a whole lot of people that didn't think this was the way to go, and eventually, about 20 years down the line, he's actually going to be pardoned. Now, his head had been chopped off, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know where all the body parts were, but apparently they dug them up and gave them a decent Christian burial, which I'm sure really pleased Jacob. But at least they kind of tried to make up, and they restored the property they'd taken away from his family when they finally figured out that he wasn't trying to rebel against the British government. There's William and Mary. Back up here. Let's get a slide back up. Come here. Speak to me, machine. They weren't bad at governing England, but they kept on doing what James II and his big brother were doing before James II was kicked out. They were trying to get total control of the colonies. What do I mean by that? A lot of the colonies were charter colonies or proprietary colonies, and they used the court system, so the parliament couldn't stop them. They used the court system to sue, to revoke all the charters, and to take away the proprietary colonies and make them all royal colonies. And while William and Mary got rid of the Dominion of New England that James II had thought up and all of that, they're going to complete this process, and eventually you're going to end up with different little colonies lumped together so that you have what we call the original 13 colonies, which became the original 13 states. Some of the changes caused by that, since they're all now royal colonies, we don't have, well, we do have a state religion. The state religion of England was the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, and so that's going to be superimposed over whatever people are already worshiping in the different colonies. That'll be one major change. Now, those are just things that basically happened in England. Except there are also wars, 4 wars, and don't write all of this down yet until I tell you what to write down, because there are long names, which I've learned because I'm a historian, but you don't necessarily need to know. There's 4 wars that I call the colonial wars of empire, the wars of colonial empire, whatever. Basically, the European powers are fighting over their own borders next to each other, and also fighting over what portions of the world they control. And the first one will be a fight in 1689. So 1689, we've already got William and Mary, and to make it simple, we'll call that war King William's War. That's what the English do. Let's follow the English pattern. Other people call it the War of the League of Augsburg, and basically this is a war where everybody joined up and ganged up against France, because France had ambitions about trying to grab a piece of Holland or trying to expand into the territory of the Holy Roman Empire. The effects that we had, I wasn't alive then, some people think I was. The colonies once again are being neglected, and since England's fighting against France, the French start into this habit that they've actually had before. Since there's not that many French people in the colonies, who are they going to use to fight their wars for them? Anybody. Who are they going to tend to use to fight their wars for them? Hello, Hale Center, anybody. Tahoka, somebody save me here. Post. What did they have lots of that if they didn't have Frenchmen?
Slaves.
They didn't have slaves. What did they have? Remember this. The indigenous people, that they were living, question number whatever it was on the thing, what colony tended to be the most interdependent with the indigenous people? The French. And so they're going to excite the Indians to attack the English colonies. That's an easy place to attack. While they're, the English are giving them a bloody nose all other places in the world, they're going to cause trouble with the English colonies. And if you look at the years, there was something that happened during that period of time that some people are reading a book about. What happened around 1692? Total silence. Somebody out there's got a book about this. 3 or 4 people have books about it.
The ocean.
Not.
Oh, the ocean. You're mean.
That's 1492. You're only 2 centuries off. But great guess. At least you proved you were alive. What happened up in Massachusetts in 1692? No. 21 people were executed as a result. One of them was executed by having rocks piled up on him until he died. A bunch of people were hanged. What are we talking about? Come on, it's the subject of movies. There's at least 4 books on our book list about it. Yes, say it out loud, really loud. Somebody woke up in my room. Good morning. Welcome. The Salem witch trials. And a lot of sociologists think that the willingness to do this, well, of course, the Europeans 50 years before had done a big witch hunt during the 30 Years' War. But a lot of people think that the pressure on the colonies, there was kind of rich man against poor man a little bit in the Salem witch trials, but there was also pressure on them caused by the threat of Indian attacks. And they were very moralistic people. Most of them were Puritans or tended to be that way. And they thought, why is God punishing us? And witches sounded like a good reason. That war is settled in 1697, and everybody just goes back to go. It's kind of like a Monopoly game when you get that card. Go back, return to go. In 1702, a second almost world-scale war breaks out between England and all of their friends, Austria, England, and others, against Spain and France, because the last Habsburg king of Spain is about to die, and he makes his nephew, who's a French kid from the Bourbon family, he makes him his heir. The people in Austria think one of their boys should be the new king of Spain because they're all Habsburgs. And the British don't think that a Frenchman should be the king of Spain because that French fellow, and his name was Philip, was also the heir to the throne of France. And the English could imagine a country made up of Spain and France, and that was way, way too much for them to swallow. So they go to war. It's called the War of Spanish Succession. Starts in 1702 and it's going to end in 1713. Why do we care about it? Once again, you're going to have some Indian attacks. Also, the American colonists are going to get involved in it, and they're going to go north out of Massachusetts, and they're going to attack and seize a French city, a French fort called Fort Louis. The French, on the other hand, are going to take all the English fur trade posts around the Hudson Bay, up further north. The British capture Acadia. And then it's all over with. We don't need to talk about Europe. They're also open British or French attacks on American cities up north. They can't stay there. They don't have enough troops to stay there, but they burned down a city called Deerfield with their Indian allies. Down around the Chesapeake Bay, apparently French agents encouraged Indians to attack down there, and a lot of people are killed. About 1,000 people are killed down there. There are settlers that are out a little bit west, and a lot of them were of Dutch extract. There were a lot of Dutch settlers down there who were not Dutch, German settlers down in that area. They call that the Tuscarora War. And then down along the Spanish-English border in the south, down below the Carolinas, Georgia wasn't there yet, or Georgia was just forming up there. They're going to attack across that border too. There was probably no real threat of them ever capturing any territory, but they did a lot of damage. The idea of them attacking that was to cause the English to stop fighting in another place to come save the colonies, but that didn't happen. But the results of the war are kind of interesting. Something I want you to remember. There's a treaty called the Treaty of Utrecht. Let me see if I've got that on here. I can find it. These are all little details you can look at. Hang on. And I list, by the way, some of the things that the French did to us. The results were kind of important. The Treaty of Utrecht was signed, ending the hostilities. The French promised that the British rights to Hudson Bay would never be disputed again. The British are going to have control of Newfoundland, the place the French called Acadia, that the British will start calling Nova Scotia. More important than that, though, was that the British got from the Spanish something which was called the asiento. It's on that slide, but it's spelled A-S-I-E-N-T-O. The asiento was the right to conduct slave trade with the Spanish colonies in the Americas. Remember, all of these countries had closed systems of trade. You weren't allowed to stick your head into another country's colonies or anything like that. Now the British have the right to transport slaves from Africa to Latin American colonies, to Spanish colonies, which is like the camel getting its nose under the tent flap or whatever. You're getting your foot in the door. To the British, at least initially, the slave trade looked lucrative, but the most important thing was that they were getting their nose or their foot in the door in Spanish colonies. But that asiento made Britain the #1 trader in slaves. On the other hand, also, the British said, all right, Philip can be the king of Spain as long as he renounces his right to be king of France in the future. And they bought into that. They had to buy into it. They'd been whooped by the British, or by the English. The Austrians, who were allies of the English at this time, got a whole lot of Spanish territory down in Italy and over in the Netherlands, or what would be part of Holland in the future. So France's domination of the central part of Europe is really, really cut back. And you find this word that you see over and over again when they're negotiating the end of the treaty, the balance of power. And what the British wanted to do, or the English, I keep calling them British, the English wanted to do was assure that no one got powerful enough to dominate them. So they wanted to maintain balance. They didn't act necessarily, although secretly they wanted to, they didn't necessarily have to dominate everyone physically, but they didn't want anyone else to be able to dominate them. So they're going to worry about balance of power, and all of Europe will start worrying about this. The British had something that we call in modern terminology hegemony over a lot of the world. It's either political or economic or maybe even military predominance or control over other nations. The technical word for nations, we say state, because a nation doesn't necessarily have to be a place with borders. That's a hegemony. So there you have it in really big letters, the asiento. The British, and I put this up here, it's totally trivia, because they won an island called St. Kitts out in the Caribbean. And you need a magnifying glass to see it on most maps. So I put it on this map. That's that big blue arrow. Big deal. Okay, moving right along. There's Acadia, which will become Nova Scotia. That's something else that the British got. That's after it's under British control, it changes names. Another thing that happened while this was going on, and we should talk about the British royal family. William and Mary lasted until 1702. So William was dead in this War of Spanish Succession. And Mary's younger sister took over. She was Queen Anne. So the British call the War of Spanish Succession Queen Anne's War. That's the easier way to write it down than the War of Spanish Succession. Queen Anne had no children. And when she dies, her closest relative is her cousin James Francis Edward Stuart, who happens to be the son of James II, who'd been kicked out. He's going to try and come back and start a revolt. He starts up in Scotland. And his cousin, Louis XIV, supports him in this and considers him to be the rightful king of England. And so does the Pope, by the way, for what that's worth. He won't succeed in getting the throne back. And later on, when we get into the 1700s, into the later 1700s, his son Charles, I put his whole name up there. Can you imagine having a name like that? Charles, Edward, Louis, John, Casimir, Sylvester, Severino, Maria, Stuart. That's a pretty good name. Probably couldn't even fit it on your business card. Anyway, the pro-Stuart people that fought on the other side trying to get them back on the throne are called the Jacobites. And Charles is going to have a try at it too a little bit later, and the people that favored him in that effort called him Bonnie Prince Charlie, and sometimes you hear that even today. There's songs about him. Okay, so who's going to be the King of England? It's a guy named George. George from Hanover. That's Germany, guys. What happened? Well, they went all the way down the list of Anne's closest relatives, down to number 32 before they could find a Protestant. They're all Catholics. And it happened to be a lady named Sophia, who was running the Principality of Hanover in the Holy Roman Empire. But she died about a year and a half before Anne died. So scratch that candidate, and her son is going to be the candidate. And he will become George I of England. He's still the Elector of Hanover, second cousin of Anne, great-grandson of James I. Had been quite a warrior in his youth, been in the army. But now he goes over to England, and it's really interesting because he can't speak English. But he's the King of England. Go figure. They were that worried about having a Catholic on the throne that they went that far. There's another war of Quadruple Alliance. Don't even worry about it. Basically, it's the English and the French now trying to keep the Spanish from expanding too much. George II succeeds his father, George I. He can speak a little bit more English. Still the Elector of Hanover, and very much concerned with protecting Hanover over in the continent, even though he lives in London. And eventually, he's going to get involved in a war that we will call King George's War. But it's the War of Austrian Succession. I don't know if I have a picture about that. Around this time, of course, we're going to get Georgia. I'm trying to find the War of Austrian Succession. There it is. The reason for the War of Austrian Succession is that the ruler of Austria dies, the Grand Duke of Austria dies, and the only person that can replace him in his family is his daughter. And he goes to great lengths to make that legal, because a lot of times in a lot of countries, a daughter couldn't succeed you to the throne. He makes that legal, and the problem is, whoever rules Austria will almost automatically become the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. And the rest of Europe doesn't like that. The English like it, the rest of Europe doesn't like it. There's going to be a lot of fighting, but it's going to involve us a little bit more than before. King George II will actually go to Europe and lead British armies in this war. And in America, what's going to happen, and by the way, that I misspoke there, because the British at this stage of the game weren't in favor of Maria Theresa becoming the Holy Roman Emperor. And they're very, very afraid that Austria will be mad at them and try and capture Hanover, and of course, that's George's bailiwick, and he doesn't want that to be harmed. So eventually he's going to get England involved in this war. They're going to send troops over there. They're going to have a new ally from a new country called Prussia. Prussia's been there, but they're growing, and they have a really smart guy by the name of Frederick, later called Frederick the Great, leading them. And they're going to start gobbling up different pieces of Europe. And what this means is eventually they will dominate their side of Europe. Austria will be pushed to the side, and they'll be kind of the seeds of modern day Germany. And the British decide they're good people to form an alliance with, and so they're busy fighting over there. But of course the French and their Spanish allies now, they've got this habit of going over to the Americas to try and draw the British away from fighting them in Europe. And the British try and beat them to the punch. They're fighting their war in the middle of Europe on land. The British Navy can't help them. So they decide to send the British Navy over and get the Spanish where it really hurts their pocketbook by capturing some of their colonies and taking away their gold. And they're going to succeed at first. They're going to go over and capture a port called Portobello, but the thing that the Americans care about is they didn't have an army to do it with. Their army is busy in Europe. So what the British fleet does is they stop off in the American colonies and draft a whole bunch of Americans, and that becomes their army to go attack the Spanish. Now remember, the French are still agitating the Indians, and a lot of these people do not want to go with the British because they want to stay home and protect their families from the Indians. So there's some ill will generated there. Some of the Americans respected the British. They certainly weren't talking about anything like independence. But kind of the important thing that we have here is the British themselves start looking at the American colonials as not being really all the way English. These colonials, they can say, Englishmen can talk right down their nose really well. Not as well as the French. The French are better at it. But these colonials, and they start calling them these Americans. And some of the Americans really don't like the English at this stage of the game because of being drafted to go fight a war which they don't think is any of their business. They're going to capture one important town called Portobello. They try to capture another one in what is now, and nowadays would be Venezuela, a place called Cartagena. They don't succeed there. A lot of people die of diseases while they're trying to do it. The Spanish at the same time are going to try invading the American colonies from the south. They're going to attack into Georgia. That's when James Oglethorpe fights them off. The British are going to go, or the American colonists are going to go back up to Canadian territory and recapture. They're going to capture Louisbourg. Over in India, they're fighting in this war. In India, the French take away British territory. There's a Jacobite uprising that goes on at the same time when Bonnie Prince
Your
Charlie
conference is
trying to rise
scheduled
up.
to end in 2 minutes.
A lot of confusing things are happening. What time is it?
Sir, do you have the time? Chapter 4.
Say again?
You
I do
post
have
chapter
the,
things.
I do have the time.
So they're not showing unit 4 is on?
They aren't showing.
Oh, they're not seeing Unit 4?
Yeah, unit 4.
Okay, I'll get that up. I'll get that up in just a minute.
Thank-
Right now, I'm trying to figure out why they're shutting us down early.
Yeah, the unit 4 lectures and reading.
I saw that this morning.
Well, we may get shut off, folks. We may have been shut off already. I don't know. No, you're still there. You may disappear at any moment. But basically, the War of Austrian Succession we call King George's War. And Americans are starting to develop their own separate identity. They're not talking about independence or anything. I always liked the admiral that ran this thing. It was a British admiral that was in control. His name was Sir Edward Vernon, but the sailors all called him Old Grog. Apparently he liked his rum. But one person really respected him. In fact, he named his own home after this guy.
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.
I don't know what's going on with the system. Go figure. Who named his home after Old Grog? You should know this. You've probably got this in your little golden book of history. It was his home and his plantation it was named after. Who? George Washington. Mount Vernon is the name of his home. Right? Okay, well, I'll turn that thing on, and I do not know what's...
Not really. Someone's hacking.
What?
Someone's hacking the system.
No, no one's hacking the system. This happens from time to time, and unfortunately, I can't get hold of anybody to explain why. Did I not pick that thing out for you guys? That's all right, I know everybody's here.
Yeah, kind of easy to roll on. See you guys Wednesday.
Take care.